Imagine a war so long that no soldier who fought in the beginning lived to see the end. A war that lasted more than a century, 116 years to be exact. This was the 100 Years' War between England and France. But why did it begin? The story is not one of sudden battles, but of kings, families, and a throne that both sides believed was theirs. It begins in the year 1328, when Charles IV of France, the last king of the Capetian dynasty, died without leaving a son. In medieval Europe, kingdom was passed down through bloodlines. If a king died, his son usually took his place. But Charles had no sons, only daughters, and so the question of succession, who would be the next king, became complicated. The French nobles gathered to decide. According to their traditional law, women could not inherit the throne. This law was called the Salic Law. It stated that the crown could only pass through male heirs. This meant that Charles's daughters could not rule France. Now, across the English Channel, another claim appeared. Edward III, the young king of England, believed he had the strongest right to the French crown. Why? Because his mother, Isabella, was the sister of Charles IV. Through her blood, Edward claimed to be the rightful king of France. But the French nobles disagreed. They argued that even through Isabella, the crown could not pass, because the Salic Law blocked inheritance through the female line. Instead, they gave the throne to Philip of Valois, a cousin of Charles. He became King Philip VI of France. At first, Edward accepted Philip as king, but tensions soon grew. Philip wanted to control the Duchy of Aquitaine, a rich region in France that belonged to England. He also supported Scotland, England's enemy at the time. Slowly, the friendship between the two kings collapsed. By the year 1337, Edward III had had enough. He declared that he, not Philip, was the true king of France, and with that declaration, the 100 Years' War began. This was not a single war, but a chain of battles, treaties, and truces, stretching over more than a century. The early phase, 1337 to 1360, the war had begun. But in the early years, it was less about great battles, and more about small raids, naval clashes, and political maneuvering. From 1337 to 1360, the war unfolded slowly, almost like a long game of chess, between England and France. The naval fights, one of the first major events, came not on land, but at sea in 1340. The English and the French fleets met near the town of Sluys. The French had a large navy, tied together in lines of ships, but the English, under Edward III, attacked with skill, using archers even from the decks of their ships. The result was a crushing defeat for France. Most of the French fleet was destroyed, and from that day forward, England controlled the Channel. This meant English armies could cross into France more easily, and French coasts were left vulnerable. The Battle of Crécy, the first truly famous land battle, came in 1346. The Battle of Crécy, Edward III led his army of English soldiers, including thousands of bowmen. The longbow was a weapon that could fire arrows faster, farther, and with greater power than anything the French knights had seen. The French army was much larger. They attacked again and again, waves of armored knights charging uphill. But the English longbowmen fired arrows in great storms, cutting down the cavalry. Even the feared Genoese crossbowmen, hired by the French, could not match the speed of the longbow. By the end of the day, the French army was shattered. It was a stunning victory for the English, and it showed the world that the age of the knight was slowly ending, replaced by the power of common soldiers with bows. The siege of Calais. After Crécy, Edward marched north and began a long siege of the town of Calais. This siege lasted nearly a year, from 1346 to 1347. The people of Calais resisted bravely, but hunger and disease weakened them. Finally, the town surrendered. Edward demanded that 6 of the leading citizens of Calais walk out barefoot, wearing only simple shirts, with ropes around their necks, ready for execution. But according to legend, Queen Philippa of England begged Edward for mercy. She said sparing them would be an act of honor. Edward listened to her, and the men were allowed to live. Calais remained under English control for more than 2 centuries. It became England's key stronghold in France, a gateway for armies crossing the Channel. The Treaty of Bretigny, the early phase of the war, ended in 1360. With the Treaty of Bretigny, the treaty gave England large territories in the south and west of France. In return, Edward renounced his claim to the French throne. At least for the moment, peace had come. But it was not the end. The war would soon begin again, fiercer than before. The Black Prince and his campaigns. By the middle of the war, a new figure stepped into history. His name was Edward, Prince of Wales. But he is remembered by another title. They called him the Black Prince. Why that name? Some say it was because of the color of his armor. Others believe it was because of the fear he inspired in France. But whatever the reason, the Black Prince became one of the most famous warriors of the 100 Years' War. Seen, the prince at Crécy. Edward was only 16 years old when he fought in the Battle of Crécy in 1346. At such a young age, he commanded troops on the battlefield. The English victory there brought him honor, and his legend began. The Battle of Poitiers, 1356, * 10 years later. In 1356, the Black Prince led a campaign deep into French territory. Near the town of Poitiers, he faced the French king himself, King John II. The French army was large and confident, but the Black Prince, with only around 6,000 men, prepared carefully. He chose high ground, and he arranged his longbowmen in clever positions. The battle began with waves of French cavalry charging forward. But once again, the English longbow rained down arrows, cutting through armor and forcing knights to retreat. When the French infantry tried to advance, the English counterattacked in the chaos. King John of France was captured, along with many nobles. It was a disaster for France. A king taken prisoner on the battlefield was a humiliation rarely seen in medieval Europe. Ransom and consequences. The captured king was taken to London. The English demanded a ransom so vast, it almost bankrupted France. Taxes rose, the countryside suffered, and unrest spread among the French people. The Black Prince's reputation grew even more. He was seen as brave, disciplined, and perhaps unstoppable. But behind the glory, the war dragged on, and ordinary people in both kingdoms suffered endlessly. * The prince's legacy. The Black Prince never became king. He died in 1376, before his father, Edward III. But his victories at Crécy and Poitiers shaped the course of the war. His name, whispered in both admiration and fear, lived on long after his death. The Peace of Bretigny, 1872, after years of battles, crushing defeats for France, and the capture of King John II at Poitiers, the war entered a new stage. By the year 1360, both England and France were exhausted. Armies were costly, villages had been destroyed, and famine and plague were spreading across the land. It was time for peace, or at least an attempt at peace. Negotiations talks began between the two kingdoms. The English, under Edward III, knew they had the advantage. They demanded money, land, and recognition of their power. The French, weakened by defeat, had little choice. They needed their king back. King John remained a prisoner in England, and France could not function without him. The Treaty of Bretigny on the 8th of May, 1360. The Treaty of Bretigny was signed. The agreement gave vast territories in southwestern France to England. Aquitaine, Poitou, and other rich lands were now under Edward's rule. In return, Edward renounced his claim to the French throne, at least for the time being. The treaty also set the ransom for King John. 3 million gold crowns, an enormous sum that France struggled to raise. Hostages were sent to England as a guarantee until the payment could be made. Temporary peace for a short time. The treaty seemed to work. There were fewer battles, merchants began to trade again, and weary soldiers finally rested. But the peace was fragile. It rested not on friendship, but on exhaustion. Both kingdoms still believed, deep down, that their claim was just and in the years to come, war would rise again. The war resumes. 1369 to 1389, the Peace of Bretigny lasted, but only for a short while. By 1369, tensions had risen again. The French were unhappy with the lands they had ceded. They wanted to reclaim what was theirs, and Edward III, though he had renounced his claim to the French throne, still controlled vast territories. The stage was set for war to begin once more. Charles V takes control in France. King John II had died in English captivity. His son, Charles V, became the new king. Charles was clever, patient, and determined to recover French lands lost to England. Unlike previous kings, he avoided rash battles. Instead, he used strategy, fortifications, and small, well-planned attacks to weaken the English. The French strategy. Charles V understood a simple truth. The English could win battles, but holding land in France was difficult. The French avoided large-scale confrontations. They fortified towns, strengthened castles, and slowly pushed the English back. Rather than rushing into battle, Charles chose patience, and it worked. English challenges. Meanwhile, the English faced problems of their own. Their king, Edward III, was growing old. His heir, the Black Prince, was already sick from years of campaigns and disease. England was also struggling financially. War was expensive, and the people were tired of paying taxes. Despite victories in earlier years, holding French territory became increasingly difficult. Impact on ordinary people as the war resumed. Life for ordinary people in France and England was harsh. Villages were raided, fields burned, and trade disrupted. Famine and disease often followed the armies, more dangerous than any sword. And yet, both kingdoms continued to fight, because pride, honor, and claims to land and throne outweighed the suffering of the people. The stage for the future. By the end of this phase, the war had changed. It was no longer just battles of knights and arrows. It had become a struggle of strategy, politics, and survival. Charles V had regained some lands, but the English still held key fortresses. The war would continue for decades to come. Henry V and Agincourt, 1413 to 1415 *. By the early 1400s, England was once again led by a strong, determined king. His name was Henry V, young, ambitious, and skilled in warfare. Henry had one goal: to renew England's claims in France and restore its honor. He was not the first to try, but his timing, determination, and leadership would make history. Henry V's preparations. Henry spent years preparing. He trained his army, strengthened English castles in France, and built alliances. Unlike some earlier kings, he understood the importance of discipline, planning, and logistics. Every soldier, every arrow, and every horse had a place in his strategy. By 1415, he was ready to march into France, with thousands of English troops behind him. The march to Agincourt. Henry's army landed in northern France and marched south. But the French were ready. They gathered a huge army, far larger than Henry's. Numbers seemed to favor France. But Henry did not panic. He chose the battlefield carefully. Near the village of Agincourt, the terrain was muddy, narrow, and surrounded by woods. This would prevent the French from using their full advantage and favor the English longbowmen. Once again, the Battle of Agincourt, October 25, 1415, the battle began. The French knights charged forward, confident and heavily armored, but the English longbows fired relentlessly, arrows raining down like storms. The mud slowed the French horses, and the tightly packed knights could not maneuver. Hour by hour, wave after wave, the French attacks failed. The English, though vastly outnumbered, held their ground. By the end of the day, thousands of French soldiers were dead, and Henry V emerged victorious. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable triumph, and it made Henry one of England's greatest military heroes. Aftermath of Agincourt. The victory at Agincourt changed the course of the war. It boosted English morale and weakened French confidence. Henry continued his campaigns in France, capturing towns and castles, but he also understood the limits of war and later sought peace negotiations. Agincourt was remembered not just for the battle, but for the clever use of strategy, terrain, and archery. And it became a symbol of English skill and determination, in a war that would last for decades more. The end of the war, 1452-1453, by the early 1450s, the war that had lasted over a century, was finally reaching its conclusion. Decades of battles, sieges, and shifting alliances had left both England and France exhausted. But France, now stronger, united, and determined, was ready to reclaim the last pieces of its territory. French victories, the French armies, skilled and experienced, won one decisive battle after another. In 1450, they captured Caen and most of Normandy, pushing the English back toward the coast. The English tried to hold on to Bordeaux and Calais, but their power in France was dwindling, and their resources were stretched too thin to continue the fight effectively. The Siege of Bordeaux in 1451 to 1452. The French laid siege to Bordeaux, the last major English stronghold in the southwest. The city resisted at first, but eventually it fell. With that, England had lost almost all of its territories in France, except for the port of Calais, which they would hold for a few more decades. Peace and recovery. With the fighting mostly over, France began to recover, villages rebuilt, trade restarted, and governance became more stable. The French monarchy, strengthened by decades of struggle, was now more secure, and the people looked forward to a more peaceful future. Significance of the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War, though long and brutal, shaped Europe forever. It ended English ambitions to control all of France, and helped unify France under a stronger monarchy. It also changed warfare, with longbows, artillery, and new strategies playing decisive roles. Heroes like Joan of Arc inspired generations, and the stories of courage, patience, and strategy continue to capture our imagination even today. A war of pride, of power, and of who had the